The Tony Tripodi Lecture on International Social Work. My name is Melissa Beck, and I have the great honor of serving as Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. The Tony Tripodi Lecture allows us to come together to reflect on trends, policies, and research in international social welfare and social work. And this important lecture enables us to invite really distinguished guests, like Dr. Hilary Weaver. Dr. Weaver is, in addition to being an alum from CSSW, has had so many leadership positions and such an outstanding leader for our profession. Of course, all of this is made possible by a generous donation from Dr. Tripodi and his remarkable example of graduates' dedication to social justice, both locally and globally. He provided gifts to our doctoral program and to name this lecture in honor of international social work, and it's an enduring testament to his contributions, not just here, but across the whole profession of social work. So let me just take a few moments to talk a little bit about Tony Tripodi. He was a much beloved member of the CSSW community until his passing in 2020. He earned his undergraduate and his MSW degrees from the University of California, and he earned his doctorate right here at CSSW in 1963. He held faculty and senior leadership positions at a whole host of institutions at the University of California, the University of Michigan, University of Pittsburgh, Florida International University as well. And then finally, he served as Dean of the Ohio State College of Social Work for 10 years until 2005. He was known for his deep commitment to social work research, and he was a widely recognized expert on global social work. As his career unfolded, he never forgot his time here at CSSW and the role the school played in his life. And our school was fortunate to maintain a strong relationship with him for over 50 years. So credit to my predecessors in this role for maintaining that strong relationship with him too. Dr. Tripodi was inducted into the CSSW Hall of Fame in 2009. My colleagues here have described him as a warm, caring, gracious, and gentle person, and an avid opera fan. He was incredibly proud of his family, his children, and his grandchildren, and I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to know him myself. But here we are at the Tripodi Lecture, which will prepare us to participate in some global conversation and to hear from visionary thinkers and practitioners like Dr. Weaver about what global social work is and what it can be. So I'm deeply grateful that we have this chance to come together. So now I'm going to turn and have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for today, Dr. Neeraj Kaushal. Dr. Kaushal is professor of social policy right here at Columbia School of Social Work and has been an invaluable member of our faculty going back to 2002. She's an economist and a journalist by training and an expert on comparative immigration policy. She is also a research associate at NEBR, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. She is the author of the award-winning book, Blaming Immigrants, which investigates the core causes of rising disaffection towards immigrants globally and assesses the validity of complaints against immigration. She has studied the effect of India's largest resettlement program of indigenous peoples in Western India. And there's a documentary about the lives of the resettled tribes called Damned But Not Damned, which you can watch on Disney, I believe. So we should do that. She's authored many, many peer-reviewed scientific articles, book chapters about immigrants, vulnerable populations. She writes a monthly column for the Economic Times of India, as well as another for the Dainik Bhaskar, India's largest daily. I hope I pronounced that right. We look forward to her new book forthcoming shortly called The Future of America is in Africa. So Dr. Kaushal holds a BA in economics from Sri Ram College of Commerce in India and an MA in economics from the Delhi School of Economics. And her PhD in economics as well is from CUNY right here in New York. So Professor Kaushal, it's a pleasure to turn it over to you. Thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Beck, and welcome to all of you. It is my honor to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Dr. Hilary Weaver. Dr. Weaver is a DSW. She currently serves as the president of the Indigenous and Tribal Social Workers Educators Association and Global Indigenous Commissioner for the International Federation of Social Workers. She served as chair of the Council on Social Work Education, Board of Directors from 2022 to 2025 and is a career-long member of the National Association of Social Workers, having served their board from 1998 to 2001. She was inducted as an NSW social work pioneer in 2020, and was named the American Public Health Association's Public Health Social Worker of the Year in 2020, and received the American Indian Elder Award for the Indigenous and Tribal Social Work Educators Association in 2017. Dr. Weaver is a professor emeritus in the School of Social Work, University of Buffalo. She received her BS from Antioch College in social work with a cross-cultural studies focus, and her MSW and DSW from Columbia University. She is our own. Her teaching, research, and service focus on cultural issues in the helping process with an emphasis on Indigenous populations. Dr. Weaver received funding from the National Cancer Institute to develop and test a culturally grounded wellness curriculum for urban Native American youth, the Healthy Living in the Two Worlds program. Dr. Weaver has presenting her regionally, nationally, internationally, including presenting at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations more than a dozen times. She has numerous publications, including the text, Explorations in Cultural Competence, Journeys of the Four Directions in 2005, the edited book, Social Issues in Contemporary Native America, Contemporary Native Americans Reclaiming Our Balance, Restoring Our Wellbeing, 2019, and the edited volume Routledge International Handbook of Indigenous Resilience. With that, let's welcome Dr. Weaver. The floor is, or the screen is yours.
Hello, everybody. I am so deeply honored to be here with you today giving this lecture. It's a true highlight for me. I'm going to be speaking with you on Indigenous peoples around the world. Don't have a whole lot of time to cover the world, but I'll at least get started on it. If anybody wants to follow up with me later, that's my email address there on the screen, so you know how to reach me. I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. We are in a place where Indigenous people from around the world have gathered. I mean, this is New York City, that's the place to come. So there's a large urban Indigenous community here and people from all over the world. So I'd like to acknowledge all of them. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I come to this topic. I am Lakota. We are one of the larger Indigenous groups in the United States. But I've lived most of my life in Haudenosaunee territory in Western New York. I live in Buffalo. And so it's a very kind of multicultural Indigenous existence, raising my kids in the city, but still keeping strong Indigenous roots. For some reason, I always knew I wanted to be a social worker, even before I really understood what social workers did. And we do a lot of things. So I went to my undergraduate degree at Antioch College. I went to college when I was 18. And as I started learning about social work, I'm recognizing the roots of our profession are very Anglo. You know, that our history comes from England. And as an 18-year-old, I'm also thinking about where I come from. And as a person of color, my roots aren't coming from England. So I'm trying to figure out, how do I fit in my chosen profession? And in fact, those have been the questions I have been trying to answer my whole life with my scholarship on Indigenous peoples, helping other social workers be responsive to diverse populations and understanding how to best serve Indigenous peoples, even when the professional values come from a different root. One of the very few words that my mother had taught me in my Lakota language as a child was Iyeshka. And that means the bridge, the interpreter. And that's what my social work career has been, helping social workers understand diverse populations. So as I speak with you today, I'm going to give you a quick overview of Indigenous peoples because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. People don't really understand who Indigenous peoples are. I'm going to talk about the persistence, the challenges, and the resilience that Indigenous peoples show. I'm going to talk a little bit about the United Nations and services for Indigenous peoples there, and also social work in Indigenous peoples. And I'm going to try and keep an eye on the time and leave about 15 minutes or at least 10 minutes so that we can get into some questions and answers. So that's the game plan. So starting with this overview, who are Indigenous peoples? We are the descendants of the pre-colonial societies who lived in and cared for these territories before anybody else got here. We are the original peoples of every inhabited continent. There are more than 476 million Indigenous people in more than 90 countries. And I'll tell you that I just updated that figure for this presentation because until recently, the numbers were a bit lower. But there's no agreed upon consensus of how you even count Indigenous peoples. So the numbers are a bit squishy, but these are the best figures that we have. These are United Nations figures. There are more than 5,000 distinct Indigenous groups. We're 6.2% of the world's population. And we are most of the world's linguistic diversity. Because as Indigenous peoples, we're not one thing. Like I said, there are more than 5,000 different groups. And we're not all the same. So many different languages, many different cultures. But what we have in common is the historical continuity with our territories. We maintain unique traditions. We didn't assimilate and just fit into the societies that have come to surround us. We are distinct socially, culturally, economically, and politically from the surrounding societies. And it is our intent as Indigenous peoples to remain distinct. So that is a core part of defining Indigenous peoples. We are of the land. We maintain those deep connections to the land. It's a relationship. We have caretaking responsibilities. It's a familial relationship to our territories. And we care for much of the world's biodiversity. Now, when you look at definitions of Indigenous peoples, including UN definitions, you will also see that it talks about how we are non-dominant, how we are marginalized within the societies around us. That is true. As a social worker who likes to maintain a strengths perspective, I do have some concerns about part of our very definition being that we are marginalized, but that's the thing that we're trying to balance here. We are a minority in our own homelands. So if you want to look up more resources on Indigenous peoples, here's a couple really good resources for you. The United Nations, they're updating the figures continuously and they're doing work on Indigenous peoples around the world. I will also point to a book that comes out every single year, The Indigenous World, which I discovered in the United Nations bookshop. And it's put together by this work group, the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs. It is updated every year. There are sections on each region of the world, and it'll tell you what all the hot issues are, what the new laws are, what the policies are, what the controversies are. It is a tremendous resource, but they also have this disclaimer on this annual book. It's put together by volunteers, by people who just compile these statistics, by people who tell the stories of what's going on in the region. So it's not heavily curated. There's no editor saying you can't put that in there, but I have found it to be an outstanding resource. And like I said, it comes out every year. It's online and it's free. So if you want to know more, there's good ways to do it. Indigenous people persist despite everything, despite so many attempts to eradicate us, to assimilate us so that we wouldn't continue to exist as distinct people. Of course, we know about military actions and displacements. There was also germ warfare. And, you know, I find this particularly disturbing. The example that I think is most prominent here in the United States, or what has become the United States, is Jeffrey Amherst. And when I taught in Buffalo, the School of Social Work is in this suburb called Amherst, named after Jeffrey Amherst. And he was this British guy before there was the United States. He was a military man, and he was fighting the indigenous peoples of this continent. And he kept journals, so it's not speculative that somebody said he did stuff, but he kept these journals. What's going to happen if I take these blankets from a ward of people experiencing smallpox and I give them as gifts to the local Native people? I hope it has the desired effect. He kept his own records. That's also available online. You can look that up. So germ warfare from a very early age. And when it wasn't attempts at physical eradication, there were also attempts at cultural eradication. Let's take the children away from their families. That's how we'll break the culture if it can't be transmitted intergenerationally. Let's take them away and put them in residential schools far away. That happened in the United States. That happened in Canada. That happened in Sweden. That happened in New Zealand. That happened in Australia. That happened in many different places around the world. Take the children so they can't pass on the culture. And unfortunately, social workers have been a part of this. We've replicated this with child welfare systems. Take the children from their families because they're better off with someone else. And here's a notorious ad that I show. Safe in your hands, the nice middle class, at least middle class, white American family out of nowhere. Nowhere, that's my community. That would be my family. We were nothing. We were a place where our children should be removed because we can't care for them. These ads are very, very disturbing. There was also tremendous sterilization. And I've got that cartoon there of, you know, pouring a lot of alcohol or some sort of sedative down an Indigenous woman's throat and then sterilizing her. We as social workers know that informed consent is important, but a lot of Native American women went in for like an appendectomy and they were sterilized. And social workers were the ones that got them to sign those consent forms. And sometimes there was pressure. You don't sign these consent forms to be sterilized. If you don't sign them, I'm taking your other kids. So we weren't really living up to our values. This picture I have of the trio, the 3 generations, that's a picture from Australia. In Australia, I think many of these countries were thinking along the same lines, but Australia was much more explicit than most other countries. They had specific policies to lighten and whiten the population. And they did it through breeding. They did it through taking an Indigenous woman and then keeping specific records of, well, let's give her to this white guy and then the children will be lighter. So that's the middle generation. What happens when an Indigenous woman has a child with a white settler man? And then what happens in the next generation? And you see that little boy, he's getting lighter and lighter. And if you're disturbed, you should be, because I am. And they have these records. Like, why do people keep these records of these awful things that they're doing? The underlying philosophy, of course, is manifest destiny, or at least that's what we call it in the United States. Here's a famous picture called Manifest Destiny. And you see this white angelic figure transcending the continent, and behind her is the light, and ahead of her, she's pushing the native people away. She's pushing away the darkness because it's a sense of entitlement that the continent will be better off if it is less indigenous. That's the underlying philosophy, not just here in the US, but around the world, that it'll be better off if you get rid of indigenous people. We persisted, but we have challenges. If you look at almost every statistic, the social statistics, the health statistics, the educational statistics, you will see tremendous disparities on how we're struggling. Around the world, if you look at the poverty statistics, indigenous people are nearly 3 times as likely to live in extreme poverty. Not just poverty, but extreme deprivation and poverty. That disproportionate child removal, that hasn't stopped. You see that around the world. You certainly see it here in the United States. I don't think we know the half of what happened with sterilization. We've only seen some of those records. We have seen some advocates stand up and talk about what happened. And we have women in this generation, because certainly within the United States, it was in the 1960s and 70s when it came out that between 25 and 42% of Native American women of childbearing age were sterilized. Well, if you're sterilizing women in the 1970s, those are the elders that we still have today. Those are the people who were not able to have children and not able to have families. Those are the people that by the 1990s were going to doctors and saying, okay, I'm ready for my uterus transplant. I'm ready to have families now. Uterus transplant, that's not a thing. But at the time she was sterilized, she was misled. Oh, you're not ready for a family yet. We'll just kind of take care of things for now. We'll just take your uterus out. So we have many challenges. There's a lot of historical trauma. Because of the connections we have across generations, we remember these things. These things sit with us, they shape us, and the contemporary trauma of the poverty, the racism, the discrimination, the marginalization, the violence. I think some of the worst things happen to our kids today in schools. And if you look at statistics, just even look at the stats in the US, but I think it's the same around the world, you will see that Native children experience more violence in the school, disproportionate suspensions and expulsions. And if you're getting kicked out of school, what is that setting for your future? And if you look at the work of Katie Johnston Goodstar, she's done some really great work around Indigenous kids in schools. And one of her articles says, our kids aren't dropping out, our kids are being pushed out. Incarceration is a big issue for many Indigenous peoples around the world. We've got that picture there that happens to have the flag of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And it says the most incarcerated people on the planet. And we don't usually show up in a lot of statistics, but that's because people aren't keeping accurate statistics. But if you look at police violence and Indigenous peoples, we're getting some of the worst of it, including Indigenous women. And there's killing of land and water defenders around the world. Most of the publicity is around Latin America, where Indigenous people stand up and say, I want clean water. I want to keep my land. But the corporations are coming in. So most of the land and water defenders who are killed are in Latin America. Behind that, it's the Philippines. A lot of stuff going on in the Philippines. There are ongoing threats. It's from governments who won't protect us or governments who are the actors who are the problem. Yeah, the trial of Bolsonaro's going on. What did he say about Indigenous people and a lot of people will say he set the stage for violence. He provoked citizens and the public to attack Indigenous peoples in Brazil. It's also non-governmental actors. It's the corporations. It's the people coming in for the mining. It's the cartels. It's the drug dealers. There are many, many threats and challenges. But we're still here. And we are resilient. And we're still strong. We retain and reclaim our diverse cultures and traditions. I couldn't help myself putting so many pictures on this slide. I mean, look at these Indigenous people from all over the world. You've got young people, you've got old people, you've got people proudly saying, I am Indigenous and I am still here. And I think a part of our resilience is we're not alone. We're not individualistic. We are nested within our families and our extended family networks and our clans and our tribes and our communities and our natural world. Relationality is core to indigeneity. The connections that we see, the river is our relative, the mountain is our relative. My cousins in the South Pacific, we are all related. We have reciprocal, nurturing relationships. And so we stand up. We stand up and we fight for people and relatives, our non-human relatives as well, who are at risk. A lot of what we know about the sterilization, that comes because of this group WARN, that I have that picture there, Women of All Red Nations. Because they saw what was happening in their communities, and they are a grassroots activist organization who stood up. And you've probably heard about missing and murdered Indigenous women. You hear more about that in Canada. That's not an issue that stays contained by a border. That is every place in the world. And activists are standing up saying, no more stolen sisters, no more missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, two-spirits, relatives. Nobody should be missing or murdered. We stand up for those who are in harm's way. Another grassroots organization. Every Child Matters is another grassroots organization, started in Canada with Orange Shirt Day. That's coming up September 30th. Wear your orange shirts. For the children who were taken away to residential schools and never came home from school, because a lot of kids died in those schools. Or the kids who came back, but they brought back the trauma and the legacy of that intergenerational trauma in their community. And so here's this picture: sovereign rights to care, raise, and protect our children. These are really important issues. And I think I just said grassroots movement several times. I didn't say these are things social workers are doing. Social workers need to be more involved with this. And that picture at the top, protect our communities. We as Indigenous people, certainly in the United States, are recognized or have some recognition of our sovereignty, that we are pre-existing nations. And when COVID hit, we acted as sovereign nations. Let's protect our communities. Let's set curfews. Let's close our border. Let's exercise our power. So our resilience is expressed in activism that has never been diminished. So a lot of stuff is going on at the United Nations, although they're a very slow-moving body. I hope most of you are familiar with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a very important document, and it echoes a lot of values that make sense to social workers. Stuff like self-determination, free prior informed consent. These are things that make sense to us. But it took a really, really long time for that declaration to get passed in the United Nations. And four of the most powerful nations in the world who stood against that, well, of course, the United States stood against it. Canada stood against it. Australia, New Zealand, the Anglo countries really stood against this declaration, finally agreeing to sign on. And it's a really important declaration. It does not inherently have the force of law, though. You can sign on and say, I'm going to follow this. Do people really follow it? Well, some places, yes. There are some Latin American countries that have integrated it into their constitutions. That's the best case scenario, that you integrate it into your national law so it has teeth. Right now, it's moral, but it doesn't have the force of law. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has happened for a couple of decades now. That is an amazing thing where Indigenous peoples from around the world, as well as a number of academics, gather every year. It's usually April, sometimes going into May. I think it's late April in 2026. Check it out if you get a chance. You can go as an academic. See what people are talking about, the rights, the justice, the things they are asking for, like clean water. There is also a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples can contact the United Nations and can say, hey, look at what's going on in my community. Look at the murders of land defenders or water defenders. Please send this person to go investigate. But the United Nations is also very under-resourced. And I think it's likely in our current world that the resources that go to the United Nations will diminish. There are other mechanisms. The UN that I go to here in New York City, that's not the only one. You know, there are, of course, in Geneva, there's a branch in Africa, there's a branch in Latin America. So these are very, very important mechanisms. I want to talk a little more about social work in Indigenous peoples. As I indicated, we have a very troubled history. We're not necessarily involved where we should be involved. And where we are involved, we have often been in service of colonial institutions, including the child welfare system. I think we need to take a long, hard look at our profession and do better, because we are better. We have strong values that fit with advocacy and standing up on behalf of all marginalized peoples. We just need to act our values a little bit better. I've seen some accountability statements. The first one that I know of is the Child Welfare League of America, 2001. At a conference of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, the leader of the Child Welfare League of America at that time stood up as a keynote speaker and apologized and said, we are part of the problem. We are part of why so many Indigenous youth have been taken from their communities. And I know some colleagues who were there for that presentation, and they still have chills just talking about it. That, I mean, it didn't solve everything to admit it, but to admit it, to say that this happened, that this was done, to take responsibility, that's a really important step. But that was 2001. That was a really long time ago. Really long time ago. The next accountability statement I saw was in 2019, and it was in Canada. In fact, I saw two in 2019, the Canadian Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Work Educators came up with accountability statements saying that we as social workers are part of the problem. Not only part of the problem in the past, but we're part of the problem now. We're perpetuating colonization. Yeah, there are moments when I'm so proud to be a social worker. It's like, yeah, we're saying something. But it was also noticeable that these statements were coming out of Canada, and Canada had had a truth and reconciliation process that I think had spurred some of this on. And here I was sitting in the United States saying, you know, where are my colleagues? Where are the social workers of the United States? Why aren't we doing something? Well, one of the roles that I carry is with ITSWIA, the Indigenous and Tribal Social Work Educators Association. And like all good social workers, we look for windows of opportunity to bring about social change. And at that moment in time, we recognized that there were 3 Indigenous social workers on the board of the Council on Social Work Education. And if we were going to get an accountability statement passed, that was our window of opportunity. So we pushed for it. And I was one of those 3. I was on the board. I was the vice chair of the CSWE board at the time. You know, there was a lot of thought that went into it. There were some questions about it. You know, what good is an apology? Do we want an apology? Well, not to be too sarcastic, but you know, I don't think an apology goes very far. And I know that in other parts of the world, I believe Australia, I think perhaps New Zealand, they have something that they call Sorry Day, and it's meaningful for them. But when I hear it, it's like, Sorry Day, really? Okay. So I wanted to do something more. It's not about an apology. It's about accountability for what we have done and what we continue to do as social workers. And we wanted a statement that was broad. We wanted something because the United States has colonized the South Pacific, Puerto Rico, not just mainland US, Alaska. So we developed an accountability statement that we believed would be usable. I think it's over 100 pages long. It's a teaching tool. And there's a later companion guide for that can be incorporated in social work education, including activities that you can do, assignments that you can give. And we got that through. So 2021, I think, is when we got that statement through. It's not just about Indigenous people and social workers. There are Indigenous social workers moving for change. And it's SWIA that I mentioned. I think we're one of the weaker partners. When I look at what is going on in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with the Tangata Whenua Social Workers Association, they are a powerful group. They are bringing about change. When I look at the Thunderbird Nesting Circle, that's our Canadian counterpart. These people are really pushing for change, and allies push for change. Allies can make such a difference if they will only move beyond the deficit perspective. I mean, in social work, we say we shouldn't have a deficit perspective. We need to take a long, hard look to make sure we're not perpetuating a deficit perspective. We need to support resilience, and we need to recognize sovereignty. Every social worker should understand what sovereignty means. We should be teaching that in the classroom. I want to talk briefly about the International Federation of Social Workers. And I do think that social workers around the world have largely been much more progressive than social workers in the United States. The way they define social work, the way they talk about social work as a rights-based profession, the way they talk about social change, the way they are inclusive and partner with trade unions and grassroots organizations. I think we in the US could do that a bit more. The International Federation of Social Workers has 4 commissions currently. And one that they've had for a long time is the United Nations Commission. And they were going to this permanent forum on Indigenous issues from the very beginning. And there were social workers sitting in those meetings and all UN meetings, not just the forum. And they were watching these discussions about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and why it wasn't getting passed and all the compromises that were being made. And as social workers, they decided, you know, the UN is taking years and years and years and years. We as social workers at IFSW can do something. So IFSW came out with a policy statement on the rights of Indigenous peoples long before the UN got their act together and did it. And I'm very proud of that. And that is because of largely these allies, mostly non-Indigenous people, I think one of whom might be online with us today. Shout out to Elaine Congress. I don't know if Michael Cronin is online, but those two, they were the driving force in the IFSW policy statement on the rights of Indigenous people that was approved at the IFSW executive meeting in 2005. That's more than 2 years before the UN got theirs through. Now, I'm not saying IFSW is perfect. Indigenous people have been looking for a role in that organization for many, many, many years. IFSW is an association of associations. So like NASW is part of IFSW. Well, where do Indigenous people fit? We're not a country, we call ourselves nations, but we don't fit in your structure. It took them a long time to figure it out, but by 2021, IFSW launched an Indigenous Commission. I'm proud to say that I'm the inaugural Global Indigenous Commissioner, which means I facilitate the 5 regions of the world. And my commission, we just got back from presenting at the Indigenous Voices and Social Work Conference in Calgary. It's an international conference that moves around the world. So that's our picture there in the middle of a presentation we did last month about our commission. The longer picture is the committee, the pre-commission, the folks who did the work to kind of push this through. So I'm going to wrap up because I think we want to have some time for discussion, for questions. But I'll leave you with these thoughts because I think they're things that we as social workers need to be doing better. I think we can learn from the past. And I've given you just a little taste of the history and some things that I think we've really gotten wrong. And some things that we've gotten right. I mean, we're a good profession. We've got solid values that the world needs today. In the present, I think we need to be engaging and partnering with Indigenous peoples. We don't do this work alone as social workers. And in fact, even when the IFSW social workers were putting together their Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I went back and looked at that a couple weeks ago. The only sources that they cited besides UN sources is they went out and made sure that every source was an Indigenous social worker. That's who they were foregrounding. That's good allyship, to open that door, but not to do it alone. It's about partnering. It's about engaging with other people. We as social work, we don't do for. I mean, it's basic, first semester social work. We partner, we do with. And we need to be part of envisioning a more just future in our shared world. Indigenous people don't live somewhere else separate and apart. It's very rare. There are a few tribes that still live in isolation. But mostly, although we remain distinct, we are part of all these other societies. And I think this is a world that is very troubled right now. I think this is a world that needs social work values of justice, that needs social work practices of advocacy. And I'm just calling on my profession to be part of shaping this world, not reacting to the world, but actively doing what we can to shape it so it is a better world. And I'm going to wrap up there and we're going to move to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Weaver, thank you so much for this very exciting presentations. I'm still feeling all the things that you talked about. It was just, thank you so much. We're so honored to have you. And there are several things that you said that will stay with me for several days. But one of the things that you talked about was self-determination. So the little research that I have done in India we use the word tribals, indigenous people, we use so tribes. And we've had several over the years programs, modernizations or something, where indigenous people were resettled or forced to resettle without any compensation. The program that I had evaluated, the only difference there was that the indigenous people were actually on the forefront. They didn't know where to get the lands, what kind of lands. They had actually been working on those lands that they were able to get as compensation for moving out of the forest. So while I agree with a lot of what other people say that there shouldn't be any push, but in this particular case, the only reason why they were so successful is because they were really they had taken charge, and they were telling the non-government organizations who were helping them as to what should be done. So it's I just wanted to share the little bit of work that I've done in this area. I would like, if there are any questions, we'll take them, but I have some questions online. Yes, please, go ahead.
Just thank you so much. I feel like you gave us so many tools that we can bring into our work, especially with students. I certainly will be bringing in the accountability toolkit into the advocacy course more. And so I'm like already thinking about how to sort of bring that into the syllabi. I was really struck by sort of the continued discussion of the harms that social workers have done. And that I think there's among some people, there's a misconception that it only occurred in the past and it's not something that's still continuing. And that's something that we really have to challenge many students on, sort of the saviorism that they bring to this field. And so I'm curious how you see that showing up in our sort of work as educators about how do we address saviorism, white saviorism in particular, to ensure that we're putting practitioners and researchers and policymakers out into the world who, at least if they do harm, can be accountable for it.
Okay, big question. I think the first thing that we need to do, especially as social work educators, is create a safe context for people to adequately reflect on who they are, on what they bring. If people think they're going to be condemned for what they're going to share, they're not going to share it. So we need to set that safe context. We need to model self-reflection. What did we learn about ourselves that is not ideal, that is not pretty? Mistakes that we have made, how we try to move past those mistakes, how we can be open to learning. So we need to really set the stage for that. We need to model that. And it needs to be an ongoing climate of safety. So it's not a one and done, it's a long-term process. And it's critical reflection on our profession. And when we reflect critically, it doesn't mean we don't love our profession. When I reflect critically on my family, it doesn't mean I don't love my family. So I think we need to put people at ease enough and have people know that they are good enough, even with their faults. And you will be better by discussing your faults. And you can use examples like, what sort of courage would it have taken for the Child Welfare League of America to stand up at a conference of almost exclusively Native Americans and say, you know what, we took your kids. We took your kids and we were wrong. So point to examples like that. But we're all in this together trying to do better.
Well, one of the questions that I have received as how do the experiences and histories of indigenous communities in North America compare with those of Latin America? Would you as
Yeah, I think that there are some great distinctions there.
Mhm.
Because whatever the settler society is, whether it's the United States and Canada, or whether it's Bolivia or other Latin American countries, Brazil, the settler societies come with their own laws and their own policy contexts.
Mhm.
In the United States, to a lesser degree in Canada, but certainly in the United States, we have seen a very racial dividing line. Race, even though it doesn't exist, kind of sets the stage for everything. You don't see that in Latin America. You see class as a defining feature. So Indigenous people get categorized differently in different societies. In North America, Indigenous people are seen through a racial lens, wrongly, because it's a political status.
Yeah.
And in Latin America, they're seen through a class lens as lower class. And class being, well, either one being potentially assimilatable, if that's a word, trying to integrate. But because of those fundamental distinctions, you see different things. Like I mentioned sovereignty a few times. In the United States, certainly in Canada, we see Indigenous people as tribal nations. You don't see that nearly to the same extent in Latin America. It's just, oh, they're different. They're poor people. They're campesinos. They're people of the land, but not a sense of sovereignty. And if you have sovereignty, that's a very different legal status. So we have more legal protections in North America than in Latin America.
Thank you. I have one more interesting question from this list. How have the attempts to deconstruct diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and funding in the US have impacted Indigenous populations?
Okay. Well, we're all targets these days, I think.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there is a common experience of being defunded, of being further marginalized. But I think there's also an underlying question that how did Indigenous people ever fit within those DEI frameworks? Because as I mentioned with the last question, we are misperceived as an ethnic or racial group, whereas being Indigenous is a political status akin to citizenship. So when we were lumped into the DEI category, it didn't really fit very well to begin with. So yes, we are under attack, but I was in a meeting recently with other members of the Council on Social Work Education Board back when I was still board chair. And a lot of people on the board were very afraid with these DEI attacks. And of course, the Council on Social Work Education accredits, and that's part of our accreditation standards, DEI. And I saw some of my colleagues being very, very afraid about these attacks. I, as an Indigenous person, felt we've seen this before. And we have survived before. And there are times I have come to believe when, if there's an active shooter situation, sometimes it's appropriate to shelter in place. That is not giving up your values. That is living to fight another day. And as Indigenous people, we have done that. And we may be in a similar circumstance. So as an Indigenous person, it didn't feel like attacks on DEI were anything new. We've been there before, we've survived, we are still here.
Okay. One question I have is how powerful do you think the art world is to expose some of these issues? And what I'm thinking of in particular is the PBS show Little Bird, which really how immoral social work was during that time?
In the interest of time, I'm going to take the two questions and give you the, yeah.
Thank you so much. And you also mentioned how IFSW is much more progressive. And I think we are seeing how pacifist our social work, we are here in the US. And I think my question is connected to your experience in these organizations and working on various issues. How do we find that courage and how do we change ourselves as a profession to take on most of these issues that you're touching on much more forcefully?
And let me just take this first.
Yeah, because I'm not going to remember these, but I'll try and be brief. All hands on deck. We need the artist as a way of communication. We need the writers. We need the activists. We need all of us. Visual ways to communicate. You saw how many pictures I had in my PowerPoint. It is all hands on deck to communicate, and we can learn. Some people learn better from pictures than words. And also, speaking of learning, we can learn and replicate from others. And when I call out like NASW and CSWE, the American Social Work Organization, I've been on both those boards. I'm calling out myself too. We're always learning, but let's learn from each other. Let's replicate things that are good. Let's go to international conferences. Like you mentioned the Nairobi conference in your class. That is the three major international social work organizations that gather every 2 years. You have an opportunity to be there and learn from your colleagues. I want to learn a lot more from my African colleagues, from my colleagues around the world. So network, engage, be reaffirmed. If you're feeling stuff isn't happening here in the US, you may be reinvigorated learning from international colleagues.
Thank you. I just feel like, not necessarily a question, but I just wanted to honor what you've done here today. I think, like you say, you know, we can critique the social work profession as we live it. And I think one of the things I love about it is in what I have observed is the unflinching way people will address harms and errors and accountability. So I want to thank you for that and for speaking so directly and unflinchingly about the pain and the violence and the cruelty that has been the history and that still continues. So thank you for that. And thank you too for your emphasis on the assets, on the tremendous strengths, on the resilience of these peoples, because it is inspiring and moving and really kind of remarkable, almost miraculous. And so I wanted just to I know it's on everyone's minds, and I just wanted to say that out loud and to just appreciate the way you've presented to us today and the way you've led the profession to face this more directly. And so I know we're coming to the end of our time, but you gave us also some really practical tips, I think, that we've all picked up on that I know I was taking notes on, and I've heard my colleagues say the same thing. And so I appreciate that as well. That's another social work characteristic, I think, is to say, here's the problem, now what do we do? So I just, we're all very grateful to have you and very honored to have you here today. Extremely proud that you're one of our alums and grateful for the work that you are doing. Thanks to you both for an incredibly rich discussion and presentation. So I think we want to thank you again.
All right, well, it's been my honor to be here, and I hope that this is not the end of the conversation. My email was on that first slide, hweaver@buffalo.edu. So I look forward to renewed connections with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you need more minutes to talk about? No, okay, all right. Thank you for those of you who are watching us online. It was really a pleasure and an honor to have you as our guest. Thank you.